and seeing this. Um, Feel free to turn on your videos. We're going to make this as conversational as possible. So at any point, if you have thoughts or you're like, Nan, you said something really interesting, this made me think of this. Feel free to just get in there. This is just going to be a nice chat session between all of us today. But happy Women's History Month. It is March. It is a time to just think and reflect back about all the women in our lives, all the things that they have done for us, and just to think about what we can do for the future and the women in our lives currently, past, present, and future. So I wanted to invite Nan, and Nan so graciously accepted to come and chat with us today. And when we were planning the session, we kind of talked about our concept of history and how we wanted to really change and adjust the way we thought about history. So, Nan, I was really curious, like we started off talking really about history in such a traditional sense, such a linear sense. Can you talk a little bit more about what people traditionally think about when it comes to history and what might be the new ways that we're going to be looking at history today?
Yeah, I can try. And, here's the thing. We had a great conversation, Nebo, planning, and I don't even know if I remember it. So feel free, right, to chime in. But I think it's I actually went back through, I have this PowerPoint, and some of you may have seen it at various events, that is actually about the history of our movement, the anti-violence against women movement. And it is a very, it's a historical perspective that I and some of my sisters of color, longtime sisters of color, colleague, friends, put together. And so it's a bit of I don't want to say it's a critique of the movement, but it's just a different perspective on how we have evolved to get to where we are today. And it's a very kind of traditional representation of history. It is linear, it's chronological, it's marked by particular events, that seemed notable. It's analytical. It's boring. It's boring. So I was like, oh, when we talked, Nebo, right? I was like, I could show those slides. But it's kind of boring and it's not memorable, right? At the time we put it together, it seemed memorable. And for a short window of time, it actually was. And many people wanted to hear it. And we were happy to tell it. But it is actually a point in time look. That's what oftentimes history is, I think. It's a point in time look. It's someone's point in time look at events that have preceded, right, the current moment. And I think that if we were to look at history now, we have to actually look at the significance, the huge significance of the current moment that we're living in. And it would change how we think about history. So history is always a work in progress. Right? I just don't think that anyone really has the corner on the market of telling history, because how we think about it today might be different from how we think about it tomorrow, literally. With a war happening, the world could change in an instant, and then history changes in an instant and how we think about it. And so I just really wanted us not to do that boring kind of oh, this is the history of the movement according to Nan and some of her friends. Because really, when it comes down to it, how each one of us thinks about whether it's the history of the movement, this particular movement, or whether it's the history of women's lived experience in our community, or whether it's the history of a quest for sovereignty and racial justice. I mean, it just really depends, right, on the story that we want to tell. So I really thought we should steer away from like um, traditional recounting of history. I have it. If people want to hear it, we could do that at a different time, right? But not tonight. And by the way, thank you all for like taking time on a evening, you know. I'm really honored, right, that you would do that. And that we could have this conversation together. It's fun for me.
When you mentioned like you're saying like this is a timeline that like I've constructed and it's like part of a critique. I find that often history is treated like it's a really objective thing, but what we're doing is we're telling a story. Like what we're doing is we're creating a progression. We're telling a story about how something came to be. And I find that a lot of times we think about activism as, you know, here's what we're do. But there's a really big storytelling is a really powerful tool, I think, to shape people into action to begin with. We forget that it really shapes people's ideas, mindsets, the way they see themselves playing in to the story at large. So how has storytelling been a tool for you? How do you encourage other people to get involved as storytellers as part of their activism?
You know, it's so striking to me that we actually have to have a conversation about the power of stories and the role of story in activism, because that is the foundation of the work we do today, is the foundation of this movement, the stories that women brought forward, right? During a time when no one wanted to hear it, no one could believe it, would believe it, people didn't want to hear it, right? It just like storytelling is the basis for everything that we do today. And so for us to now have to like say, okay, how do we reinvigorate storytelling? How do we bring that back into our work, into the fold of what's important, you know, about what we do? It's just an indicator of how far away we've gotten from our roots, you know. And I think we're doing a good job of identifying like whose stories matter, you know, whose stories are missing, whose stories are being misrepresented and told by others in a way that they lack fidelity to the truth of the person's experience. You know, so we've evolved a lot in terms of how we receive and perceive stories. But this thing of like that we have to work now, right, to do storytelling, it's just, I don't know, it's kind of sad to me in a way, because none of us would be having this particular conversation had it not been for the stories that women told, right, courageously, from isolation, from experiences of like abject brutality, you know, and degradation and suffering 50, 60 years ago, right? And that we've now turned those into sound bites or data fields on intake forms, you know, is really, I don't know, it's just says something about like, you know, how where we've gotten to. And so I'm like really happy actually about this thing about stories. And here's the thing, they take time, right? They take time to tell to completion, to tell in whatever roundabout, you know, non-linear fashion that they need to be told. And we often don't have the time. So it's this thing about a return, right, to storytelling means that we also have to return to like a generosity of time, a willingness to sit with and to listen. You know, like we cannot really do storytelling, the kind of storytelling that we need to do in a 10-minute Zoom. We have to actually figure out ways to be with, you know, and to just let the story emerge and unfold and take the turns that it needs to, right, in order to be complete. And so the task, there's a task around storytelling that is more complicated, right, than just bringing voices forward. It's actually like, what are the conditions in which the story can be told, and how do we create that with each other and for each other?
This is just reminding me of, we had this training at New Beginnings in December, and part of the training was we had somebody who actually supported clients experiencing intergenerational trauma through, you know, working through their ancestry, and having this chance to actually think about advocacy as beyond just the service model of like, I do X, Y, and Z for you, I get you this money, this thing. It's really like, how do you support how do you support somebody as they build their personal narrative about how they came to exist on this earth, you know, working through that generational trauma, and how do they transforming through that. And I find that to be really empowering, because like, again, people are coming to us, and they're coming to us in the midst of a story, in the midst of a crisis time of their story. And when we think about the hero's journey as this journey that people go through in life, our role as advocates can really be to help them make sense of that transformation they're going through right now. So what are some things that you recommend to people to start seeing, you know, that everybody has their personal story, and that, you know, this movement does go beyond just servicing people. It's really carrying space for them to be who they are.
Well, it's really, I mean, it's really interesting, because I think we have to really revisit what we believe about our relationship with survivors, right? With people who have been harmed, with people who have been affected by harm, right? With people who cause harm, with people who witness harm. We have to really think about our relationship with those people, because storytelling is about a relationship. It's not about like you talk, I hear. You know, I think it's really about what you think about what happened to you, or what you did, why, what could have made a difference then or 20 years ago that might have you know, like resulted in a different outcome. Who around you, you know, cares for you, cares about this? Like, it's just, it's like storytelling is it is an interactive process, a relational process, even when one is quiet, right? So I think we have to really change our mindset as a movement about that kind of client advocate relationship, and have it be, you know, kind of like more, I don't know how to put it, neighborly, you know, like, I know this thing happened to you. Tell me about that, you know, and tell me how I can help, no matter what that is, right? No matter how big, no matter how small. Am I the right person to tell this story to? You know, but like, storytelling is really, it's an exploration. It's not a menu of services, right?
This reminds me often, like, we actually had this prompt at New Beginnings for staff to share, memories of their childhood friendships. And Ginny remarked that, it's not often that we get to hear stories of our early childhoods with each other as adults and coworkers. And it makes you realize how much of our personal stories we're leaving off. I know there was this doctor that we had worked with when at my last agency, and he actually, when he would meet with clients who he would get referrals from people who were experiencing sex trafficking. So he often sat with them and would block out 4 to 6 hours just for that one patient, which is very unheard of. If doctors, they would try to work fast as much as possible. And you know his style was that he would just sit down and just be like, so tell me from the beginning of your childhood, like, how many siblings did you have, where were you born, and just working slowly through, how did that person get raised, what was their family structure, what were the notable memories that they had. And I think it's a really powerful thing to make someone feel like you are making a space for them to be able to share these parts of you that we actually don't make a point to get to know about.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, especially now, like in the digital social media world, right? It's not conducive, right? That aspect of our culture is not conducive to deep storytelling, to deep story receiving. It works against it. So it's like we have to have an intentionality about this, like a serious intentionality about it. I myself I don't think of myself as a storyteller. I'm a scientist. I love science. I'm linear, like I like numbers, all of that. But hearing stories and then figuring out from time to time how to tell my own, it's a game changer. It's really added, it's like adding color to a black and white picture. That's how I think of it. Like, we can have a black and white picture and see something and think that that's okay. But that's like when you add color, it's like, oh, now I can see,
Nan, I was actually just going to ask a question sort of around that. I think,
Okay.
Something that you touched on with this idea of returning to storytelling, and it being, I, from my background, thinking about how much data actually drives the conversation so much, right? And how it's primarily this like white supremacist model that we're often locked into. And so I guess I'm wondering, thinking about Neva's example of that doctor who blocks out 4 to 6 hours of time. That's obviously, as they said, not the norm. But how do we kind of provide that space when working within these frameworks? Is it to fight against those frameworks in order to provide more space? Is it just kind of finding those places where we can push back? Sure, maybe you are going to get to that, but I'm just really curious your approach.
It's a really tough question, because the frameworks, right, as you pointed out, tend to be like white dominant culture frameworks, and those aren't going away anytime soon, right? Most likely. And in fact, like we're just part of this moment in time, right, is like this tilt towards not just white supremacy, but white nationalism is so alarming and so concerning that I actually feel like we have no choice but to try to figure out ways to work outside of the frame. Now, an organization like New Beginnings has a lot of credibility, reputability, You have your own history. You know, you have influence. You have powerful people on your side from within and from without. And so you're really well positioned to actually figure out, how do we work outside of the frame? We can do work within the frame, and we should, right? Because that's what's going to keep the money coming in for now. And like, you know, it's a little bit of appeasement, but to do that strategically so that you can actually spend some time working outside of the frame and sitting with people, survivors, families who have been impacted by violence, ought not be that far outside of our frame. And I actually think we can fit it in the frame. It's a bill, you know, in like you know, insurance terms, it's a billable period of time. Right? And
Yeah.
and there's nothing, here's the thing. Our work with survivors has become like this thing, like widgets, building widgets, you know, and I often wonder if we would have more impact with going deep with fewer people than trying to spread what we do across many, 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 you know, because I don't know that we're actually facilitating meaningful, sustainable life change for that many people. And that's really hard to say, you know, because it's not to say that we're not working as hard as we can and as fast as we can, and as like with the most commitment that we can muster. But it's to say that we're driven so much by a fear of letting anyone down, especially a survivor who's calling for help, right? And a belief that providing some little something to 1,000 people is more important than really creating change for 3 families. And I don't know. I really don't know. If, you know, I don't know what I think anymore. It always makes me think of this guy, Jeffrey Canada, who used to run the Harlem schools in Harlem, right? And he said once in an interview, so here they're working with an incredibly marginalized, disadvantaged population of students, right? And he said, he was asked what the school does for the parents. And he said, it's too late for them. We're focusing on the children. And I was like, wow, that's bold. It's too late for them. So we're putting everything we've got into the kids. And, you know, Debbie, I see your hand.
I have a question about what you're talking about with the story, because I'm now a little confused on who the audience is for the stories.
Mhm.
Are we talking about healing families? Are we talking about potential donors? Are we talking about the public knowledge of this issue? Because those are all different stories, right? Those are, we need to direct different stories to our different audiences.
Ah, that's a really great question. I mean, I was going to just say yes.
Okay, but
Okay.
then.
But here's the thing, like we've, I want to be careful when I say this, but kind of one of my first thoughts was like this thing about manipulating stories for an audience that can be strategic, but it also takes, I think, like the integrity out of the story, because we're saying I think it can, to say to a person, for this audience, we want you to focus on this thing. For this audience, we want you to focus on this thing. Here's why, because we're attaching a goal to the storytelling, right? We're saying, like at a fundraiser, We want a survivor to tell her story. We want her to do it in a compelling way. And then after she tells her story, we're going to ask people for money.
Mhm.
So yes, there is a goal around people hearing her story, having compassion, believing it, valuing her courage in standing up and telling it. But the end goal is that we want people's money,
Mhm.
right? If we said to her, you know what, you matter to us. What happened to you matter to us. However you want to tell your story, whatever you want to say, that's good enough. Please take whatever time you need.
And that's a different goal, right? So that goal is to validate that woman and her story.
A storytelling experience, in my opinion, should always result in the storyteller being and feeling validated.
Okay.
Because if
Sure,
not, then
sure.
that
Yeah,
process
yeah.
is not healing.
Then it's BS, right?
Yeah.
I understand that, but I guess if there's other reasons, depending on the audience, again. So if you're working with someone as a service provider, then you're working with that woman so that she will heal or be validated or whatever. That's different than working with the legislature, working with donors,
Sure.
working with the public.
Mhm.
And I just remember one of the things that when I was a youngster, and I
Just
heard
yesterday.
that, yeah. And I don't remember where it was or how it was, but that 1 in 4 families have abuse in their
Uh-huh.
families.
Yep.
And I just remember looking, and like they said, it's in your church, it's in your religious group. And I looked at and I just remember going to services, looking around in my group going, oh my God. And I don't know if I don't know if I've heard that again over the decades. I don't
Now,
know if
here's
people
why,
are
because it's
relating to
become
that.
1 in 3.
I don't know
Okay.
if I don't know if like people in my group, my social group or my community are even aware of that. I don't know if we've gotten that message out that it's so common because it's such a secretive thing, right?
Okay, so here's the thing, Debbie. The storytelling is not it will not necessarily in and of itself give rise to an awareness of the data. Right? It will give rise to the significance of a human being's lived
Mhm.
experience and what justice might look
Mhm.
like for that person and the family, and what is needed in order to create that. And what we've done is over the years as a field, right? And you'll notice sometimes I say field and sometimes I say movement, but as a field, we have collapsed, we've extracted themes and collapsed stories into data nuggets. Now, and because that is what people want, and people don't want the story. They want proof. And so what my worry is like, then does that mean that we're basically saying to survivors, to individual survivors, hold on, sister or brother, I don't need all the details of your story. I just need enough so that I can add it to my data set, right? And use that as a way to get, yes, things that could be helpful to you, but also things that could be helpful to our organization, things, you know, I just,
Mm.
that we like us trying to resurrect, if you will, storytelling as a
Mhm.
meaningful activity, you
Mhm.
know, in our work can't happen in a vacuum, right? The whole of people, right, also need to be reminded of the value of storytelling, like of the value of being read to as a child, you know, having someone who cared enough about you that they would read the same book, Cars and Trucks and Things That Go, over and over and over again, every single night of the week, because you loved it, right? And to have people who have been harmed be able to have an experience where their sense is that for them to tell a story over and over and over again is worth it. You know, that we were willing to go there with as many people as can do it. It's a fundamental change in how we think about like just our relationship. But it can't be a one-way thing, right? It can't be just I as an advocate or a board member or a donor or whatever. Now I get it. I want to hear your story. I want to hear these stories. It's like, then what do we say to the next person, to the next friend that we talk to, you know, to another donor, to the board, to whoever? What do we say about that? Was amazing. And, you know, people's stories, what's your story? You know, like just to really flip even just how we think about how we relate, not just to survivors, but to like everybody. You know, if we
And
had all the time in the world, literally, if we had a long time this evening, especially if we were like all hanging out together and we had a few bottles of wine or whatever, you know, we had big comfy chairs, I would ask a series of questions and I'd want to hear your stories. And I think we'd want to hear each other's stories. And here's what I would ask, right? I would say, let's think about the last 2 years. Okay, these last 2 years. What happened? What happened? Okay. And some of you might talk about COVID. Some of you might talk about someone that you lost to COVID. Some of you might talk about what, like how crazy it is to try to work, you know, to do this work that we do. Some of you might say, I really like working at home. You got a lot of house projects done. It doesn't matter, right? You'd have a story because every single one of us has a story about these last 2 years. Okay. And so we'd all like, just like listen to each other. And then I would say, what does it mean that that happened? Whatever the story is you told, what does it mean that that happened? And you would tell another story, right? And then like, okay, we'd hear all those and they'd be as different as we all are, you know? And then I would say, and now what are you called to do? Based on whatever,
Right.
you know, and each
Right.
one of us, right? And I'm telling you, I guarantee it, we would all be sobbing. Okay. Because that's what's needed. You know, it's been like such a time. And that is like the daily experience for people who are harmed by violence. Right. It's not just these last 2 years. We've like me in my privileged life, I've had just the littlest taste of stress. And some of it has felt very ugly. You know, I haven't been proud of myself. And I'm very privileged. You know, I'm not living in a violent home. I'm not, you know, I have a home. I mean, it's just, so I don't know. I think,
so I think the stories do depend on the audience. I think
Okay.
we agreed on that a little bit.
Sure.
And I do think, well, I know, because I work in healthcare. I work in process improvement. I'm a change agent in healthcare. It's about change. And I know how we emphasize the stories, because even doctors now want more than just the data. They do like data, but they need more. And the nurses totally need more. And most people need more than just data. So I'm totally agreeing with you
Mhm.
on the importance of the story and the importance of making it applicable and short.
So I do want to push back on the idea that a story has to be palatable for a certain audience. I think that storytelling is a tool for transformation, and part of that is transforming the group that you're talking to, not in ways that that group seeks to be transformed, because, donors, again, like we've mentioned before, and Lauren's mentioned, donors want the success stories. And what we're doing is, I think, like Nan said, is manipulating that story, but we're no longer letting that hero's journey that's happening happen naturally. I think that the story itself is powerful. And I think stories, when you hear something unexpected, they can inspire hope, they can inspire change, but they most of all inspire connection, right? Like, we are, like Nan said, living in a world where we have so many constraints that we have to work within the frameworks. But when we can, edge just an extra inch and allow ourselves some extra room, let's do that. And this one story comes into mind in particular. Well, actually two, but I'll tell you the first one. I do a lot of community engagement and social change work with young people. And part of that, is doing these groups, talking to kids about, X, Y, and Z. And we have those metrics. How many kids did we serve? How many sessions did we have? Did they pass their post-test survey? But one of my favorite times ever that really just expressed how wonderful the services we provided was actually, like, I had this one teen in a youth group who stayed behind, and she was like, I really just want to talk to you all. And it was silly. She had two boys asking her to prom, and she couldn't figure out which one to take with her. And so we actually just sat down with her, and we created this funny crush chart, it was an X and Y axis, and we charted them. We were like, okay, how do you feel about this person? What's the progression between this person? What's the progression between this person? Pros and cons. What's the pros of going with this person to prom? What's the cons of going to this person prom? That's not a story I can tell any grant funder about, really. I mean, I would love to. That's the world I want to live in, is to say that, hey, actually what's valuable about these services is that it creates the space for young people to reconstruct their idea of what romance means to them. And often, it just makes me think of the ways we hold space for our interpersonal friendships. One of my favorite things is when I ask about, friends and their romantic stories, when I ask about their breakups, I love to ask, like what Nan said, what did this mean to you? I will always ask, when it comes to love, how did this shape your idea of what love is for you? How did this shape your love ethic? And, I actually have this beautiful response, because people are never asked these questions around their self-concepts of love. We talk about relationships, we talk about behaviors in relationships, but actually each one of us contains ideas about love, about faith, about hope, that are shaped by these personal experiences and really shape the trajectory of how we behave and act as we face life. And I think, when we think about the data points and all these things, those are constrained within the work that we do. But I don't want to be constrained in the work that we do. I want to be achieving a vision that we have for the future. And storytelling allows us to kind of free ourselves from those limitations, right? Like, the idea that something should be short and applicable is within the restraints. And that's functional, and you have reasons to do that, especially, in different healthcare and stuff. But when we're thinking about the future, right, and the storytelling, and this is really the heart of the conversation that we're going into, is how do we think about the story we want to tell in the future? And how do we get there? How do we start to map, hey, in 5 years from now, I'm going to look back and think about what these experiences mean. And I think if we can, like when we are having survivors tell stories about their lives, that story is not finished yet, actually. We tell these stories as if this has happened to me. I came to New Beginnings and I did X, Y, and Z, but that story has not even completed yet. I've had wonderful people coming to me at the farmer's market and have said, you know, I actually came to New Beginnings years ago and their story is going to be so different now. And so I just think about how storytelling is not, it's not an object. It's really a tool for transformation. It's really, you know, this way that we get people to think about their lives. And again, write freely, edit often, right? Continue to write that story and continue to reflect back, but don't hold yourself with any limitations on like, this is who I'm going to tell my story to. So now my story has changed. It's really giving people that space to think and process.
Yeah, and Nebo, one of the things that you were saying there, I'm going to try to amplify a little bit too. This thing about, okay, you remember how I said, like, I have this PowerPoint slide deck about the history of the movement. When I started this work at New Beginnings, incidentally, in 1982, I did not think that would have that when I was 40 years later, or however long that's been, frightening length of time, but I did not think that was the history I would tell. I had no idea. No one had asked us, what do we think historians will say about this movement? What do we think women of color, what do we think their observations will be on the evolution of this movement? I just didn't imagine it. Okay. And if I had imagined it, it would have been really different from what has actually transpired. Okay. Now, I love this work and I love most of the people who do it, not all of them, but most of them. And so, that means that it's not easy, right, to say, wow, I really wish this had gone differently. Okay. But now, knowing what I do, I think, what is the story 25 years from now, right? Or even 20 years from now. So whenever that is, 2042. What is the story that we want people to say? Like, what's the history that they're going to report on of the last 20 years? And what do we want that to be? What do we want them to talk about? And so it's like, we have to imagine then 20 years into the future and say, what is it that we wish for then? Not just in terms of like our services, but in terms of the world and in terms of like the opportunities, the environments, right? The what's possible for the lived experience of like all families, particularly, right, those who reside in the margins through no fault of their own. Okay. What's the story that we want to be able to tell then? What's the story that we want to hear, right, then? And then what are the conditions that are necessary in order for that to be able to be so? And it's those conditions that we have an ability to work on starting tomorrow morning. If we can plot backwards in time, right? This is where we want to be in 20 years. This is where we should be then in 15, in 10, in 5, and so forth, and go backwards, right? It gives us a map for how to go forward. Now, I wouldn't expect to see, I mean, literally, I mean, I might be alive, but I don't know. It's terrible to say, but I'm not sure I'll still be doing the work 20 years from now, but I would, if I did, if I, I hope I can see that we've made intentional progress. When we started this thing all those years ago, we did the best we could. We really did. We did the best we could with very little. You know, when someone comes to me now and says, I need more, I don't know, whatever they say. I need a bigger hard drive on my computer. I'm like, what? You need what? You know, because like back at the old New Beginnings where I started, we needed umbrellas at our desks so that the apple juice that was pouring down from the children's room upstairs was pouring through the vents, didn't like get all over the phone and all over the papers that we were working on. That's what we needed, umbrellas. And now people are asking for bigger hard drives. So like this is our evolution, you know, our evolutionary story. But we could plot that out, right? Where's the technology going to take this world in the next 20 years? Are we going to have like, we're going to have drones delivering, I don't know, delivering everything, you know? Are we going to have retinal eye scans be the way that we collect identifying data on the people we serve? You know, I mean, there are all these questions that we need to be able to anticipate so that how we construct our work and evolve our work is still focused on the human and the humanitarian and the humanity of the people that we're with. I just like, we cannot let that be taken from us, ever. We cannot. And people are trying really hard. People are trying really hard to take that from us in all kinds of ways. And so like, we've got to carve out the time and the space to actually be able to anticipate it so that we're not always on the defensive, right? So that we're not always surprised and then on the defensive. Because that's a really hard place from which to have a positive evolution.
That makes me think of, you know, sometimes it's important to think about that future because you never know when it actually is your present. Like I had, it's just making me think of this college presentation I gave, and I thought it was going to go okay. I was like, you know, we're just going to do the standard DD 101 with this college group here. And I under-delivered so hard. It was a really, I really had to sit with myself and I was like, Neva, why'd you do that? Because I realized that the future, when I had first started working with young people, we did not have a lot of relationship education. You know, talking about consent in schools was new. It was a new curriculum. Now it is more standard. And so now we're seeing people who are going into college, who I have taught. And I'm like, oh, you are the age range that I first began working with. You are now the future. This is the norm. You are expecting more of me because the future that we wanted is here now. And so it's really like, it's amazing to think about when the future comes, you know, you can't lose that vision because now I'm like driven. I'm like, oh, what does relationship education look like now that more young people are experiencing it as a standard? There's only more ways to grow from this and only better ways to deliver services and more education. So it's really interesting, like having that constant idea of a future, because the future becomes the now and then history is ever evolving.
Here's the other thing. When we focus on imagining the future, there's a lot more commonality than there is difference. We're in a time now of incredible divisiveness and engineered divisiveness, right? And so when we're looking at the way things are and the way things have been, the retelling of history, it is a source of like that feeds the divisiveness. So it's very hard to find common ground. But if we're casting forward, if you know, it doesn't really matter who one asks, right? If we ask like you know, the elders of the Makah tribe, right? Or if we ask children in a school here in Seattle, or if we ask, you know, I mean, if we ask a faith leader, you know, what's the world that they imagine 100 years from now, right? 5 generations ahead. Pretty much they'll say very, very similar things. You know, so we can find common ground in vision that we cannot find in an analysis of the way things are. And like that common ground, that we need that. We need that, you know.
So we have about 5 minutes left, folks. I just want to open up the floor to any other questions, any other comments, you know, even if there's something that's like, you don't have a question, but you're like, this is making me think of this, please let us know.
This is making me think of a lot of things. What you said earlier about like, would we have more impact going deeper with fewer people versus spreading all of our resources is something I've been really struggling with lately. Moving from community mental health therapy to private practice. For community mental health, you know, you're going to see like 9 clients a day, but did you help anyone? And private practice, I maybe only see 5 clients a day, but there's impact on every single one of them. So that's something I've been really struggling with because I want more clients. I want more impact, more people. But my supervisor is trying to manage that and help me see that with less people, I'm making a deeper impact. And I lived in Seattle for a very long time. I've only lived in Olympia for the last few years. So it's a much smaller community than I'm used to. And the resources are much more limited, and clinicians who are willing to even see someone who's still in the domestic violence relationship is very limited. So the idea of limiting my caseload when their options are already so limited is just really hard to navigate. But just hearing you say that and like just being reminded that that is what people on all parts of this fight are fighting, of like, do I help more or do I help deeper, I guess. This was all just like a great reminder that I'm not alone in this fight. It's not me and my clients against the world. You can feel that way in these smaller towns. This is becoming rambly, but just a lot of thoughts happening, and this was really great and needed, and I feel like reinvigorated kind of.
I mean, I think anytime we come up against any kind of rule of engagement, whether it's a rule that we like or a rule that we don't like, we should be asking ourselves these 3 questions, right? I always use these questions. What if, why not, and to what end? Because the to what end is about the imagination, right? And if there's no imagination represented in the rule of engagement, then we really have to wonder, why are we doing it? Who is it serving? Not the person sitting right there with us.
Yeah, I'll often ask people when they're looking for training or some sort of education. I usually am like, tell me your wildest dream. Tell me your wildest dream. Like, if you had no constraints, you had that 100 of me, like, where would you want to be? And that's usually like, it's a funny question, because like usually the answer is like, we can't do that yet. But it's just, it gives people an idea of like, let's break down the limitations, you know, like what if we have a future where you have a ceiling where there's no more apple juice coming down, right? Like, what can you do if that's your present now?
You know, time is a really funny thing in terms of history, right? Time compression. It's like the longer we exist as a species, the longer, I don't know how to say this, but it's like the longer the history becomes, but our sense of the history actually becomes more compressed because we're only aware of a little bit of it. And like, here's an example. Okay. My father, who is almost 94, He's quite elderly, he's quite frail, and he's, mostly he's like his cognitively there, and he has a few slips. So he fell recently and cracked a rib. And so I was talking to him, he said, well, I cracked my rib. And I was like, oh, well, do you, should we get you to a doctor? Are you sure it's not broken? He said, oh no, it's cracked. Because it feels exactly the way it did the last time I cracked it. And you remember that, Nan, it wasn't so long ago. We were building the fence at New Beginnings. Okay. We built that fence at the shelter that was sold a few years ago, 1983. Okay. And my dad was like, that was pretty recent. I was just like, okay, Dad. Okay. So time has a way of compressing itself. And I think it's like we need to examine the history of our movement. We need to hear about it from lots of different perspectives, and then we need to understand that in the scheme of the universe, it's very short. It's very short. And so it is never too late for a course correction. It's never too late to say, what ought our history to be? Right? When whoever lands on this planet in 3,000 years and they find the little time capsule that says, violence against women, what are they going to find in that? What do we want to leave behind? That's like, we got to have some humility in this, that we are here for doing this for the time that we do. And then it's someone else. Right. And at this point, like in my career, what I'm hoping is that I can help spark some imagination so that like 5 generations from now, people there is much less, right, sexual violence and domestic violence, that it actually is deviant and an aberration, right? But that people will say, wow, there were people who paid attention to the culture and to the conditions and to the dreams of young people. There were people who wanted the legacy of the ancestors to come forward, and who respected that certain cultures knew how to do that, right? And that we embrace that again. And and things might be better. So I don't know. Gotta imagine. Why not?
Why not? Life is short, again, a next generation and traveling it forward. We are living in the future that a lot of previous generations wanted us to live in, and now we have to change and adjust it for the future as well. Plant those seeds. It is 6:33, so I'm going to kindly ask people, if you have any last questions, you're free to hang out with us. I'll be around for a little bit, but I also just want to mark, Nan, if you have other things to do as well and need to hop off soon, please do, and as well as other folks. But really, again, thank you all so much for being here. This was just a lovely conversation. I know, again, so many of the times we talk about history and we're like, data point, 1982, we did this and this. 1983, we had a fence made in the shelter, apparently. But it's just really nice to think about history and our storytelling. How do we want to see ourselves from 5 years from now? How do we want to see the movement 5 years from now? And how do we work towards that?
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thank you
it.
all. Really great to see you all. Really fun. Melinda, good to see you.
Yeah. Thanks, Nan.
Yeah.
Thanks, Linda.
Jenny, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, Paige. Really fun to hang out
Thank
with
you
guys.
so much.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you so much.
Sure.